right? Peoples aren't, it's important. And this is the material aspect, right? They're not being targeted because they're of a different racial group, right? Or religion or something like that, right? They're being targeted because of one of two things primarily, right? The land or the labor, right? And in this case, we're predominantly talking about the land. And so racialization then comes in, right? Because I think fundamentally it's widely understood in terms of ethics, in terms of legality, right? That taking other people's land and livelihood, enslaving them or exploiting their labor, these are fundamentally understood to be immoral, right? These are wrong things to do, right? And this is why settler colonialism is coming under so much fire right now as a framework. So then the question is, right, since this is so universally and well understood and clear, particularly right as you move into the second half of the 20th century in the era of decolonization, right, after World War II, right? So how does it happen that it's normalized, rationalized, and justified, these kind of processes in their ongoing way? How can something that is just so obviously happening right before our eyes, right? And you think about the genocidal manifestations we're seeing now, and that's where the racialization, that's where the race making comes in. You need to dehumanize another people in specific ways, right? And as you already alluded to, Morgan, right, that can go different ways depending, and I won't go into the details, right, but around based on whether the targeting is for land or labor or some combination of the two. And you have to take dehumanization to an extensive degree such that a genocide can be widely acknowledged by scholars of the field, by all sorts of organizations, and by international legal bodies and multilaterals, and yet still be found to be acceptable or ignorable by so many, right? And certainly by elites in positions of power, right? And so it's essentially, right, as that allusion, that quote from Ghassan Abu Sitta lays out, right? It's putting people beyond the realm of moral concern. How do you do that? You racialize them, right, as terrorists, for example, right, which has happened to indigenous peoples in almost all contexts of settler colonialism. And so those narratives, right, that have been so prevalent and have, are often called out, right, they're all linked to that settler colonial drive, right, for land and the need to dehumanize and the need to eliminate, right? And people are more easily erased and eliminated if you can racialize and dehumanize them in very specific ways. And so I think that gets fundamentally back, right? There are indigenous scholars have written books about, the labeling of indigenous people as terrorists in North America, and that link between the two, right? Between the U.S. as the world's first modern settler colony, in the words of Mahmoud Mamdani, and Israel, right, which is itself a settler colony and also is part of the U.S.'s imperial machinations around the world and around the Middle East, right? And has obviously been involved in reactionary counterinsurgencies from Latin America to the Middle East and beyond, right? So it's part of that larger U.S. global hegemonic project as well. And so for those reasons, right, and because the United States has racialized Native peoples, Black people, other, groups in these ways, and marginalized them and allowed this dehumanization to happen, it's much easier for these kind of narratives to take root, right, and to really take root within the population. And certainly it's organic within the elites, right, and the ruling institutions of a state like the United States that continues to occupy native lands of hundreds of native nations, right? And so those things are very organically linked. So I'll go ahead and stop there. I don't want to go too far, and I know I want to hear from a lot of our great panelists today. So thanks.
Great, yeah, and thank you, Brahm. And I'm just going to kind of Brahm had a kind of nice overview of thinking about settler colonialism, and I'm kind of going to zoom in to talk a little bit about some of the specifics that Brahm talked about, kind of zooming back into the genocide that's happening in Gaza. Brahm mentioned that there's certain practices and acts that can be carried out once a people is sufficiently dehumanized, and in a way that Brahm said, beyond the realm of moral concern. And that's, precisely what's unfolded over the past 15 months. So I'm going to just walk through a couple of slides that just give you kind of a sense of different types of tools of elimination and dispossession that have happened over the first 15 months of the genocide. So this first slide is looking at a very simple analysis during the initial 6 to 7 weeks of the genocide, looking at the percentage of women and children combined to the overall total kind of gross mortality that has happened. So you're thinking about women and children, this doesn't include male civilians. So it's obviously a very conservative estimate, but you can imagine what this percentage may look like if there was an attempt to kind of strategically or even target, combatants or so-called combatants. And you can see here over the first 7 weeks that the percentage or the proportion of women and children killed stays pretty level at about 70% or even ramps up towards the end there. So one, there's a level of tolerated indiscrimination of attacks, not only by the Israeli military, but also the international community. Again, and thinking about that direct result of dehumanization, how can you do that? How can you actually perpetrate killing 70% civilians if you do not dehumanize the population sufficiently? And that is, throughout the rhetoric that we heard early on and kind of throughout the first couple of weeks of the genocide. And then second, there was no course change. These numbers were known up front and early on, and so there was no course change. That proportion doesn't change. It continues persistently. So you would imagine that if the objective was to target combatants, that number would change over time. You want to go to the next slide, please? And this is just another slide that shows, again, the patterns of civilians killed, again, women and children, very conservative estimate throughout the different attacks on Gaza over the years. And you can see in 2023, 2024, this number is, dramatically and disproportionate. Again, even to some of the other attacks that had 40% women and children killed throughout those attacks. Go to the next slide, please. And then this is a slide that is looking at a geospatial analysis of looking at water facilities, health infrastructure, and educational facilities across the Gaza Strip. Again, this is only the first 7 to 8 weeks of the genocide. And we've seen the forced displacement that's been happening to the Palestinians across the north and other parts of Gaza throughout the year, again via several different mechanisms and means. One is evacuation orders, but this becomes again very telling of kind of tools of dispossession within those first 7 weeks. Everything that you can see in gray on the screen, that kind of middle image, is damaged, just gross damage to infrastructure. And if you think about what is needed, the kind of bare minimums to sustain life in a location, these are certain things that you need: education, water, and healthcare. And so, as you can see, if you are completely there's complete destruction or even partial destruction of these structures, especially across Gaza City in the north. You can ask the question, how can life be sustained? People need to move. People need to be able to find these certain facilities and these certain water, food, and shelter. So again, another way to think about tools of dispossession throughout the genocide. And then I have one more slide just to show this was some work we did looking at, again, think about the direct implications of, the U.S. being complicit and in full support of the military. This is a geospatial analysis looking at Mark 84 bomb craters, which had been in the news quite frequently. These are 2,000-pound bombs that leave 15-meter craters and can be seen by satellite. So even if you can't be on the ground to or on the ground to be able to identify or kind of track these craters, you can see them from space. And so, again, asking that simple question, what type of infrastructure is needed, connecting it back to health to sustain life, and also thinking about questions of international humanitarian and human rights law, we looked at what are the proximity of these bomb craters to hospital structures and health facilities. And there are two specific distances that are important. One is under 360 meters. If you are within that range, it's considered a death and almost complete destruction of infrastructure because of how great these bomb blasts are. And then the 800-meter diameter, which is a distance of kind of severe injury and still infrastructure damage. And what we found that 25% of hospitals had at least one bomb crater within 360 meters, and 80% or more of hospitals had at least one crater within 800 meters of a hospital. And again, this is only the first 6 to 7 weeks of the genocide unfolding. And some hospitals had up to 23 bomb craters of these 2,000-pound massive bombs within 800 meters. So again, just thinking about tools of dispossession, about attacks on healthcare and how that plays into kind of the grander or the greater understanding of what's unfolding during the genocide.
So I guess I'll go next because Morgan, you directed that question to me. First of all, let me thank Morgan and the group that put this together. It's really an honor to be here and share this stage with my colleagues and my dear friends. So yeah, I want to talk a little bit about anti-Palestinian racism in the context of the quote that Morgan had from Dr. Abu Sitta, and then dovetailing with what Bram and David have said. I mean, it's rather catastrophically obvious that dehumanization, delegitimization, and erasure is part of the Israeli-American project in Palestine. And that is painfully obvious in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, and in historic Palestine. There's just this 76-plus-year project of erasure, right? We sometimes think about that as happening in historic Palestine only. But rather, if we take a broader perspective on it, we can see that this systematic attempt to delegitimize, dehumanize, and erase anything having to do with Palestine or Palestinians is actually part of a global, systematic, and systemic effort that crosses borders. Because of this, we decided, a group of colleagues and I decided to form this institute, the Institute for the Understanding of Anti-Palestinian Racism, because we were very concerned about how state power in the United States was being used to silence, delegitimize, and erase Palestinian voices who were rising up to not just condemn the genocide in Palestine, but to push back on it, to demand a ceasefire, to demand an arms embargo, or frankly, to show solidarity. We have seen perhaps the largest global solidarity movement in the modern era of our global community standing in solidarity with Palestinians, unlike anything we've ever seen. But we also know the pushback on solidarity activists was very intense and very extreme. And there was an attempt to delegitimize those voices and efforts. We had heard about it. We had known about it. We were seeing it every day. In my own university at UCSF, people were being fired and written up for wearing a watermelon pen. Watermelon, seasonal fruit, was becoming dangerous in the workplace. So we conducted the first national survey of anti-Palestinian racism in the United States, and we did that between March and April of 2024. We surveyed over 1,200 individuals, and the findings that we reported on and found were rather staggering, actually. Of the 1,200 people that were surveyed, over 70% of those individuals either experienced directly or witnessed others being attacked for their Palestine solidarity work. And that's a rather extreme number, and this was occurring at every segment of civil society. We were seeing it in the workplace. We were seeing it in educational centers. We were seeing it in public spaces. In fact, there wasn't a single space in our civil society here in the United States where anti-Palestinian racism wasn't rearing its head. Now, in this context, anti-Palestinian racism, as I said, is an attempt to silence Palestinians and their allies speaking about or engaging in this solidarity kind of work. So the fact that over 70% of our respondents either experienced it or witnessed it is a rather significant number. The other finding that we were quite surprised about, frankly, was the negative health consequences. And there's a large body of research on the negative health consequences, obviously, of racist structures in medicine and society that is well documented. We were surprised, but not totally blown away of the fact that our respondents not only experienced anti-Palestinian racism, but it resulted in a number of physical and emotional negative consequences. So, for example, many people, again, over 70% of the people who experienced anti-Palestinian racism felt isolated, felt alone, felt distressed, felt unable to sleep frequently. We're having this whole host of what we call stress responses to being a part of this anti-Palestinian racist specter that was happening throughout the United States in our sample. So they were experiencing it, and as a result of that experience, they were developing and having all of these symptoms and of distress that were carrying through in these various spaces in the workplace, in educational settings, and so forth. People also reported above the 70% threshold that they were feeling fearful of advocating or speaking in solidarity with Palestine or with Palestinians, fearful to speak. Now, if we can imagine the fear of speaking occurring at a time when a live genocide is happening, that people are going to the workplace or they're going to their educational spaces and they want to be able to say something, but they're fearful about it. This also dovetails with our other finding that the majority of people who, and this was actually close to 80% of our respondents, also felt isolated from one another or from community spaces because of their Palestine solidarity work. So the last finding that I'll just quote is that 55% of the people who experienced anti-Palestinian racism experienced it from someone in a position of power. So this is supervisors, managers, senior faculty, teachers, administrators, so that we see that state power can be exercised, in a grotesque way in terms of the destruction of lives and infrastructure in Palestine. But that state power can manifest itself also on the ground when it comes to Palestinians in the diaspora and solidarity activists with Palestine globally, that there's this global attempt to shut down, to isolate, and to create fear and intimidation among people who, in fact, are acting in solidarity with Palestinian attempts at self-determination and liberation. With all that being said, I just want to make sure that, because this was part of your question, Morgan, one of the things that we're hoping with this research and these findings is that we want to reduce, obviously, the amount of isolation that people feel, because we know that, and I'm saying this to all of us who have this kind of experience of anti-Palestinian racism, clearly you're not alone. You're part of a very large minority. What you may be feeling, thinking, and experiencing is not something that's isolated to just yourself, but it's actually something that is shared among large numbers of people. and that you really are part of a larger community. And when you feel that sense of a larger community and you see that this is part of a systematic attempt to silence, dehumanize, and delegitimize Palestinians and Palestinian narratives, you could see that you're part of this larger effort that is connected, actually, rather tragically, to what's happening on the ground in Palestine. So I'm going to stop there, Morgan, because I'll keep going forever. But I'll just stop there for a minute.
Your answers. I think we're going to take some of the questions at the end, so we'll wait until we've kind of finished the first three discussion questions. We have three kind of central questions to address, and then we'll take some of the questions from the Q&A in the chat. So I wanted to move on to the next question, which is for Dr. Jabour and Dr. Kumerle. So Dr. Jabour, in a conversation with Francesca Albanese in August 2023, so before the latest genocidal campaign in Gaza began, you suggested that activism in solidarity with Palestine has been ineffective because, quote, we have been dancing around the real crime that's being committed, and that correctly diagnosing this crime as genocide is essential to treating it appropriately. So 2 weeks ago, the ICC issued arrest warrants for Netanyahu and other officials, and there's really overwhelming agreement from experts across pretty much every field that the IOF's military campaign in Gaza has crossed the threshold of genocide by all of the defining criteria. We've seen expert analyses like those of Dr. Mills and Dr. Wispaway published in academic journals using like geospatial analysis, epidemiology to prove that a critical infrastructure, healthcare facilities, and healthcare workers themselves are not only lacking the protections that are afforded to them by international humanitarian law, but also are being disproportionately targeted. Congress has been presented with evidence that US weapons are being used in a manner that directly violates international law. The diagnosis of genocide has been definitively established with the authoritative weight of international legal bodies, academic experts, and the firsthand testimony of countless physicians who provided care on the ground in Gaza. And yet with this clear diagnosis, the US federal government, with a growing minority of dissenting voices, continues to provide Israel with the weapons that are being used to systematically slaughter an entire population. So Dr. Kumerle, I had the great pleasure and honor of accompanying you on visits in Washington with congressional representatives this spring, and we met with like reps and senators and policymakers. And I can say that for me, it was at least like kind of a profoundly surreal experience to see how little all of these facts, what we might call the truth of the diagnosis, how little these facts actually matter to the people who are voting on whether or not to send more bombs. So I wanted to ask you both, as physicians who are kind of like senior leaders in the movement of solidarity for Palestinian activism for many, many years, how do we kind of understand this dystopian reality where international law and scientific evidence doesn't really seem to carry the weight that we all hoped it would when it comes to stopping a genocide? And how does this kind of reality, how can it inform our approach as healthcare workers who are organizing against the genocide? If you both want to speak to that.
Yeah, go ahead, Karam.
I think you should go.
Okay, so yeah, thank you, Morgan. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for organizing this. So my name is Nidal Jabour. I'm a Palestinian doctor with an American citizenship only. So me and Karama were, classmates in medical school. We both grew up in Palestine under occupation, and we felt the weight and the torture of living and growing up under the occupation all our lives. And all our lives, we always thought, what can we do to lift this occupation? And we were naive enough that we're thinking this is an occupation. There is international law, there is international community, there is, United Nations, and there are governments that care about, international law and justice. And at one point there will be peace and there will be a solution to this conflict. And actually, our journey with this started after talking with a group of Israelis, almost 5,000 of Israelis and Jewish Americans and international, activists about finding ways for peace. And after talking with them for a long time, you realize that, as our colleagues mentioned here, they don't see the Palestinian as an equal human being. They only see the Palestinian as a demographic threat. These are the pro-peace Israelis. These are the best kinds. But the majority of the Israelis see the Palestinian as a security threat, as terrorists, as violent people, as people who are posing a threat to them, and that they do not see any feasible solution, any feasible peaceful solution to this. And they don't see the Palestinians also worthy of equal rights or equal self-determination like the Israelis or the Jewish Israelis have. So in many of these discussions with them, actually, we have been many times threatened that if the Palestinians do not play nice and do not accept all the conditions we're imposing on them, then they should expect a second Nakba. And the second Nakba is coming in the way if the Palestinians do not change their curriculum, if they do not behave, if they do not change, all their view of what is happening and give up their nationhood or nationality and their concept of selves as people. And at that time, we start reading about apartheid, about genocide, about prolonged occupations. And the more we read about it, the more we felt this is a genocide happening. It's a genocide in the making. And that was a few years before October 7. We're not talking about now. And the more we read, we became really scared, especially after the right-wing government in Israel came in the last few years. And they start carrying programs in the West Bank, in Nablus, in Hawara, and they start burning villages. And you're talking about, ministers in the government demanding this, and publicly, they are not even hiding it. And at one point, actually, we felt so scared, and we felt an imminent genocide and mass-scale genocide is in the making, and all what they are waiting for is an excuse for them to launch a full-scale genocide. And we tried to reach out to many Palestinian organizations to warn them of an imminent genocide happening. We actually reached to Francisca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Palestinian human rights. That was 2 months before October 7. We told her. At that time, she was publishing a report about all the prolonged occupation, the practice of the occupation, and the determination that what is happening is an apartheid. And we told her, yeah, that's true. It's a permanent occupation. It is an apartheid system that's been happening for 100 years. Palestinians have been saying this all along, but no one listens to them. And we have to wait for an Israeli NGO or a Western NGO to come and say, oh, there are some elements of apartheid for the world to start noticing. But we, the Palestinians, we knew it all along. And we think that it's not just that, it's all these crimes together with an overarching strategy of genocide. So even the fact or the concept of settler colonialism, I don't think there is anything called settler colonialism. It is there in theory, but in reality, I'm not an academic, so my colleagues here know better than me, and I'm willing to learn. But I've never felt comfortable with the phrasing of settler colonialism. This is just an academic term, but in reality, settler colonialism always involves genocides. Genocide is embedded in that. The only reason that it was not included there because our institutions will not allow this term, will not allow to say settler genocidal colonialism. Because without genocide, if it's just settlement, if it's just people coming to settle and being nice and willing to live with each other, with the other groups, that's nice. I mean, I don't see a crime in this. But there's settler genocidal colonialism. And genocide was taken out because our institutions, our academia, our politicians would not allow the term genocide to be, the word genocide to be involved there. Plus, when you add genocide, then the term has teeth. It has a legal implications. Settler colonialism by itself is not illegal. There is no international law that says settler colonialism is illegal or punishable by any means. But when you say genocide, then you are talking about you know, a determination that does have legal ramification and legal impact. So we start thinking that what's happening is genocide, and we thought that as a medical community we should have a role to play in it, and we start studying the research of the previous century, and to our surprise that all the wars in the 20th century, including World War I, World War II, resulted in the death of about 50, 60 million human beings. All the pandemics of the 20th century resulted in the death of about 30 to 50 million people. But genocide alone in the 20th century cost the loss of 250 million human beings, which means that genocide alone has a higher public impact and disastrous implications on life, on public health, than all the wars, all the pandemics included. And it was very surprising to us that the medical community never even tackled this issue from the public health standpoint. I mean, genocide is a bigger threat to human life, to public health, than all the other, you know, crimes or elements or threats to human life combined. And we thought maybe since we are doctors and we go to school to protect life, and we think that our mission and our moral obligation to protect life, and since we focus on prevention and we want to find the most effective way to protect the sanctity of a human life, we thought that the medical community, by intervening in this and trying to prevent genocide, raise awareness against genocide, use their leverage with politicians to solve these conflicts peacefully early on before they turn into mass graves, we can save more lives than our traditional role at the bedside and doing surgeries or sending, you know, medical missions and humanitarian aid, which is all good. I mean, we're happy to do that. But if our goal is to save more lives, we should have more say. We should have more voice with politicians to intervene and solve these conflicts as soon as possible early on, and that we as medical community should be trained to detect these early warning signs and risk factors for genocides, for apartheid, for injustices everywhere in the world, if we really want to save more lives and protect humanity. And as Dr. Gannam said, I'm going to stop at this point because I can keep going on forever. Dr. Hawash.
Well, thank you so much, Nidal. You covered it all, and you know, I was planning to speak to the students about my own journey as a medical doctor and how I am dealing with what is happening in Gaza right now as a doctor activist, and that's what I started calling myself to my colleagues. You know, in medical school, you will start learning how to take care of patients one-on-one in an office or in the hospital. But like Dr. Jbour said, medicine is politics and politics is medicine, and politics can cause death of millions of people. And if we are able to intervene and prevent diseases, we succeed as a medical community. And if we as a medical community do not have the language and do not have the information to be effective advocates against death by genocide, disease by genocide, and disease by war crimes and crimes against humanity, I do not think we are trained well as doctors. So the framework of our activism is very much educational, and the medical students are our hope for the future. We, in the medical community, have been not very effective in being active players. A lot of us go to medical schools because of good grades, because of aspiration to do good in the world by providing care and being, you know, being somebody who can help. And also for materialistic factors. It's most of the time it's a good job. You have a good life, And I think we are doing our profession injustice by stopping there. We should be active players on the world scene by knowing the language and having the tools to be effective advocates against war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And that is the premise of our organization, Doctors Against Genocide. And I encourage you all to check our work. Our mission is to mobilize the medical community, educate the medical community, give the medical community the language, the tools to be effective advocates against these atrocities. We believe in numbers, and Dr. Jbour shared with us the numbers that we're dealing with genocide. In 1 year in Gaza, a whole society has been destroyed. If we can prevent that, if we are able to unite and prevent that, we are way more effective than going to work every single day, seeing one patient in 1 hour or even in 2 hours. So the work that we can do together to prevent something like that is not to be underestimated. Dr. Ghannam talked about anti-Palestinian racism and how we are pushed against. I am very aware of that, but I believe in the power of truth, and I believe in the power of our profession and the power of our oath. And when we say, do no harm, and we swore an oath to protect life, no one can argue with us, no one. So no amount of anti-Palestinian racism is going to tell me that I should not talk about stopping genocide. And I think our institutions that are playing gimmicks on us, literally gimmicks, by canceling a lecture or not allowing people to wear a kufiya, or not allowing the students to say they are against genocide, they are doing a disservice to themselves that is not to be underestimated. So we have to be strong because we are on the right side. We are not asking for any harm. We are asking actually for the right thing. We do not want bombs to rain on children. We do not want hospitals to be destroyed. And we do not want genocide to happen, because anti-Palestinian racism led to genocide for our people. Dr. Ghannam, Dr. Jbour, myself, we are all Palestinians, and we know what it is to be so oppressed to a degree that you are seeing your people die and you're not able to do anything. And it's not a good way to live, or a good way to exist. And we have to be able to speak up. Our allies also have to speak up, because they are doing the right thing by speaking up. If people did not speak up against slavery, we would still be having slaves, or against having women vote, women would still be not voting. So a vocal minority that is on the right side has always made history happen. So I am hopeful, and I'm hopeful that all of us together will see the light, and we will be more effective as activists, doctors, because that's the way to be a doctor. Being a doctor and waiting for your accolades or your publications, for some of us that means a lot, or for the high salary, that is not a very satisfying way to exist as a medical doctor. But together, as people who can move humanity in the right direction, that's a much worthier goal for us as a medical community. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what I felt like saying to everyone. So I will also stop here.
Yeah, thank you guys both so much. So we have just two final questions that are related that will open to the panel as a whole. So first, I wanted to kind of think through the question of like the general framework of where do we go from here? I mean, Dr. Hawash, you talked about believe in the power of truth, which I love the sentiment and the idea, but I feel like after being in those rooms in the White House with policymakers, like at this point, how much does the truth of what's been proven like by the ICC, by the issue of the arrest warrants, like when truth doesn't seem to matter to the people who are actually making the political decisions, like where do we, what's the, like, how do we use our advocacy effectively when it just seems like every time we're in these spaces, the glaring reality of what's going on fails to make a difference? Like how do we kind of adopt our strategy and like sharpen our tools? And can these academic frameworks, like thinking about settler colonialism or anti-Palestinian racism, I guess if we, well, for me, what those tools allow us to kind of understand and get to, like if we think about both the Israel and the US as operating according to the logics of settler colonialism and racial capitalism, and therefore it's not that they're broken, but they're working exactly as they were designed to, like how does understanding the system and their goals, how can that inform like our strategies as activists, and kind of how do we move forward in holding these institutions accountable for their complicity in perpetuating the genocide? And open to the panel as a whole.
Yeah, Morgan, if I may, I'll quickly say something. Yes, it's very frustrating, but the world changes, and the world always, there's always hope that we can move our reality to a better reality. One thing that we have control over is the medical institution. Medical institutions are super important. We are in such a position of power as a medical community. And we have started a campaign called Not Another Hospital, Not Another Child, Not Another Hospital, with healthcare workers for Palestine, Doctors Against Genocide. And it is a campaign to mobilize the healthcare workers together to engage with medical institutions, associations, societies, and invite them to call with us for protection of children, protection of hospitals, protection of medical schools, ceasefire and an arms embargo, and places to educate about anti-Palestinian racism and racism in general, because racism, as we know, is lethal. We're hoping that this will be something that is modeled from one hospital to another clinic, to another country, to another city, and that it captures the attention and the hearts of the medical community to actually speak up, because the facts are very available. Each hospital has a lobbying office. Each medical association has a huge lobbying arm. We want these lobbying abilities to actually work against genocide, not for genocide. We have legitimate asks, and we are building the numbers and the ranks to be able to push. And for that, we need each other, and we need everyone around us to be strong and to be determined.
If I might add to this also, just build on this. As I mentioned earlier, I mean, we knew it's a genocide from day one, and even before October 7, we knew it was a genocide. So when October 7 happened, me and Karama, we jumped to DC right away, because we knew this is a genocide is happening, and we were hoping that the politicians, once they know there is a genocide or a threat of genocide, the minute you tell them that, the minute you explain to them all the intentions from the Israeli government, that they will just listen to us and be nice and take action to stop this from happening. But after going there, week after week after week, and it's been 14 months now, we realize that politicians don't care about life. They don't care about the truth. They don't care about justice. They don't care about how much people are lost. They care about their electability, their interests, who is supporting them, which lobby is behind them, what's their chances of winning again. And after honestly months and months of, maybe more than 10 months of trying with DC, with politicians, we gave up on that, and we thought that actually it is time to change our strategy and tactic and go back to our community. We really think the medical community, despite that this community has been sanitized and neutralized forever, and we think the Western medicine is a neutralized, sanitized medicine that is only meant to serve the privileged, and in a way it's became capitalized, and it moved medicine from the real moral obligation of medicine, from protecting life, into just a business model like any other model. But we still think that our colleagues, the healthcare workers, are the closest ally in this. They should be the closest ally, and we really need to mobilize them because it's our oath. I mean, we go to school literally to save life. So if us, the doctors, the healthcare workers, the nurses, would not stand up and mobilize and unite to do this and to defend the sanctity of life everywhere, then this world is a hopeless case. So that's why, as Dr. Commonly mentioned, this campaign is directed against the medical community to mobilize everyone, all of us. We are not asking the doctors, the students, or the nurses to become politicians. We are only asking them to become real doctors, real nurses. Live up to your mission. If your mission, if you go to school to protect life, then it is time to do so. You can protect more life by stopping one war, one genocide. You can save more lives than all your practice for a whole century. If we can stop one genocide, one war, if we can do a ceasefire now, one day sooner, we are saving more lives than sending missions for a whole year. So we are hoping that our people, our community, the people that, I think we have more hope in them than the politicians. Once they unite, if we mobilize the medical community is very powerful, not just the United States, all over the world. The medical community can cripple any country. It can cripple any politician. If we all unite and use our voice in a tangible way, we can really make a difference. And I really think the politicians, the governments, the institutions of the world failed humanity, failed the children of Gaza, of Sudan, of Congo. They have been failing all over the place. And they're not even a failing. As Morgan mentioned, actually, they are doing exactly what the system is supposed to do, which is capitalism and war machine, and keep creating wars and injustices so they can sell more weapons and weapons. The only segment in the community that I think should never benefit from war is the medical community. We have no incentive in allowing this to happen, and we should be, having the higher moral ground and the ethical compass than the politicians. And when everyone else fails the children and the humanity, I think the medical community should lead. We should be the leaders to change course and save humanity from the imperialistic, desires of politicians, of governments, of institutions. And as the whole course of humanity changed after World War II, and we have all these international laws or universal laws, I think this genocide is another wake-up call for us to also make this a watershed moment in the history of humanity. I know the Palestinians suffered a lot. The people in Gaza paid the full price for this. But the least we can do for them is to try to save whoever are left there, and to make a dramatic change in the international community, that their loss, their sacrifice did not go in vain, and that whatever they went through, we can use it to protect humanities and other vulnerable communities all over the world. Because the Palestinians are not the only ones who are going through genocide. They are not the only community who are vulnerable to genocide. So if we can learn from this and establish and change course in our institutions, in our way of approaching things as a medical community to benefit not just the Palestinians, but people the world over, I really think we would be doing the best service and, making the right lessons out of this.
I'll jump in next if that's okay, Morgan. I just want to say that what Dr. Hawash and Jabur just said is completely spot on. And I don't want to sound overly optimistic because I'm not, but I'm not pessimistic at all. And Morgan, I know that it was very frustrating for you, as it is for a lot of my students and a lot of the young residents that I work with, because they see this obvious thing that should stop immediately, because we all feel that in the core of our existence, that when we honor our oath, Of course we stand up against genocide. Of course we say no to bombing hospitals. Of course we say not one more child. But to put it in a context, we're running a marathon and not a sprint. And from the point of view of like Dr. Jabbour or Dr. Houash and myself, who've been doing Palestine work, solidarity work since we came out of the womb. That's what Palestinians do. We do this our entire lives. This is the first time for the three of us that we've seen the medical community kind of get on board with Palestine, because historically that's never been the case. We've done our activism outside of our professional life. And for the first time, we're seeing this kind of integration of our professional life with our activist life, because all Palestinians are activists. All Palestinian doctors are doctor activists. We've always done that, but we've been siloed. Now we're unsiloed. Now we're coming together. And what Doctors Against Genocide is doing is so profound, is so deep, is so important, because we are seeing shifts. If you look at the generational shift, if you look at medical students now, if you look at residents now, they are universally and unequivocally pro-Palestinian and are part of the Palestine solidarity movement. They just are. But we need to organize this large group. We need to organize people. We need to give them kind of a sense of how to become doctor and healthcare activists. And we're on that road. This is a historical moment that is unlike anything we've ever seen in our lifetime. And we have to seize this moment. And as Dr. Jabbour and Dr. Houash have said, we have to do it in such a way as bring together the medical community, which has a unique moral authority when we honor our oath to say no to harm wherever we see it. Not just in Palestine, not just in Sudan, not just in Congo, but everywhere we see it. And that's really what this is about. But remember, this is just to your experience, Morgan. When you run a marathon, you don't want to sprint, the first mile, right? So it's just a way to kind of contextualize this and the struggle that we're in. It's a long one.
Yeah, and I'll just add that one of the things that this moment has helped really clarify for many, many people, right? And this is, you can't put this back in the bottle, right? Is where that movement building can really happen, right? And Nidal was already alluding to this, right? Which strategies kind of worked and which didn't, and right, and building within the community, building within people who right have the possibility to move forward, right? Because I think regarding that question, Morgan, it's so important, because I think what these frameworks and this understanding can help us do is shed some of the confusion and misunderstandings, right? Especially around where many institutions, academic institutions, are structurally aligned, right? And what we now know, right, is our academic institutions in this country are structurally aligned with colonial occupation and genocidal counterinsurgency, completely, to the point where you can't talk about it, right? Or if you do in any significant way, they'll find various ways to punish and silence you, right? That I think is very, very clear to many people now, right? So struggle over institutions is vital. We have to understand that appealing to settler capitalist power, right, which profits from genocide and apartheid, right? And that's what the divestment campaign is all about, right? It's not really going to work, right? So we can't expect universities that are aligned with the genocidal project, that are really falling over themselves to demonstrate this commitment in how they're treating their students, right? Who were very strategic and very much, I think, understood that, right? And took an appropriately antagonistic stance, understanding where those alignments really were, right, with the encampment movement. And I think that's why it's been, was so effective, right, despite all the incredible amounts of violence and threats that the universities brought down on them. And so I think, we have to build that alternative nexus of power, right, that Nidal and Karama and Jess and, and so many others, right, are doing, that you all are doing, like, as students, right? And I think, understanding, right, that means people are organically aligned, right, with the Palestinian people and with these struggles for freedom and liberation and what that really means. So I think, I'll just finish with, right, to think about what it means that they're structurally aligned, right? So University of California, right? It's a land grant institution. What does that actually mean? What does that actually mean, right? That's from the Morrill Act of 1862. That means 11 million acres of native land was taken and put aside for settler universities to train people in, among other things, martial violence, right? As well as in agriculture and how to maintain that stolen land and produce capitalist wealth out of it, right? That's what a land grant university, that's the basis, that's the origin of a land grant university. It was part of the process of stealing native land, and it's a result of that stolen native land. And then it produced knowledge, right? It was a center for knowledge production to justify and rationalize that stolen land. That's a land grant university. That's the University of California's birth, right? So that kind of understanding can put us on a very different path of what we need to do and what it would actually take to transform a university, right? Because that would require an acknowledgement, right, of an ongoing occupation and all of these other things. And I think that creates a better sense of which kind of alignments are going to be productive and are going to be less capable of elite capture, right, from these institutions that are structurally aligned with genocidal counterinsurgency, right? So I think students have been doing a brilliant job of that and have been teaching all of us
Absolutely.
really important
Absolutely.
lesson.
For the final question, before we open it up to questions from the audience, kind of building on the last one, I want to ask how you see these kind of same frameworks, these theories of anti-Palestinian racism, settler colonialism, as how we can actually understand the mechanisms that you talked about, Dr. Wispaway, the mechanisms that are being used by institutions across the country to silence, repress, and discipline healthcare workers and medical students who are advocating for an end to the genocide, and how might understanding the logics through which these repressive functions actually operate help us collectively identify ways to resist them? Like, how do we understand them? Like kind of the ways you were alluding to, Dr. Wispaway, like how do we understand them as very much embedded in these larger projects of settler colonialism?
I'm happy to add just a couple additional components there since I started going down that direction, right? So I think, the settler colonial elimination, right, takes more forms than just the physical genocidal piece, right? That's what we're seeing. The narrative erasure is crucial, right? You have to control the narrative. This requires enormous amounts of repression and propaganda, right? And forcing people who are like, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense, right? Forcing them to be silent in one way or another, right? Either through self-censorship or other forms of censorship, because the basic ethics, stolen land, genocide, right, are so clear, right? They're so clear. And so it takes enormous effort, incredible effort. And the universities have said, hey, we're willing to do that job. Sign us up for US interests, and shutting up all the students and all the people who refuse to watch another child murdered, right? That's and so there are so many different tactics, right? Of course, they're taking, right, and they spent the whole summer planning that out, right? And there's some evidence that's been effective in terms of the student movement, but I think yeah, again, like that narrative control, that discursive control is a huge part of the project, and that's where institutions of higher learning are key sites of struggle, right? And so that's what's so encouraging to see at this exact moment. And the more that folks are willing to step out and to do that work and to really come out and say, I'm for Palestinian liberation, right? I'm, of course, for the end of genocide too. Then the easier it becomes to really break down, all of those barriers, all those various forms of tactics, right? All the ways they're trying to take individuals, right, and punish them, fire them in maybe the most extreme cases, and various other things. So that's just kind of but I think I think everyone here on the panel too has had various experience with this over the last year and maybe long before, and can speak to some of the mechanisms and some of the strategies to deal with them.
Well, the mechanism and the strategy, Bram, is just fear and intimidation. And, what we see in these land-grant universities at the University of California are serving, the settler colonial project. They do it physically, but they do it psychologically. And they create kind of a settler colonial internalization, a settler colonial mind that we have to help our students and help each other decolonize our own mental anxieties and fears of, repercussions and the things that people, when we did the study, it was rather amazing to hear what had been internalized in terms of fear, loathing, and anxiety and depression and stress about just speaking. And we have to break down those internal psychological barriers and oppressive forces that get people who morally know what is right or wrong, but still feel something that prevents them from standing in solidarity or from acting morally and ethically. So, and we can do that more effectively if we do it collectively. We can do it more effectively only as a collective. And that's why this kind of panel and this kind of discussion is so essential, because power ultimately comes from psychological power over people to get them to, at some level, either not resist or to accept their fate. And Palestinians, we're very familiar with that form of power, and we've been fighting it for 100 years or more. So it's the same fight. We know what's right, we know what's wrong, we know what we have to do, and we have to release ourselves from that anxiety and fear about speaking and acting in a moral and ethical way.
I want to just add a couple of things. So as a disclaimer, I'm not an academic here, which is a good thing and a bad thing. I mean, it's bad because I'm not as smart as my colleagues here.
Oh
I'm
my
not
God.
as knowledgeable as
Here
they
we
are.
go, Nabil. Here we
But
go,
the good thing
Nidal.
about it is I'm free. I can speak whatever I want. I do not expect any censorship, and whatever I think is the truth, I just go and say it. So in a way, I feel privileged, but I feel also with, I'm in solidarity with my colleagues, because I know everything you have to do, you have to think, go all through these processes and censorship, and would they approve this and not approve that. And so, I mean, at this point, we all know that the institutions that we have, all of them, whether the education institutions, governmental institutions, international institutions, have failed 100%. They get an F mark on every level. And that's why we really need to revolutionize the system, including the institutions. And this revolution has to come from inside and from outside. The reason that the fight against this genocide started with the students, not with the grown-ups, not like with me, not with the academics, not with the professors and those you've been studying history and stuff like that for decades, is because these institutions have been manufacturing consent for genocide, for capitalism, for imperialism for decades. So in the beginning, me too was surprised. I mean, why is Harvard, why is University of California, why is Columbia are censoring these students? Then after a while, I stopped being surprised, because I thought about, oh my God, I mean, it's not, I mean, the excuse that it's because of donor pressure is not true. It's not because of donors. It's because the institutions themselves, they are built on this. They have been a factory to manufacture consent for all of us over decades and decades. The only reason that the genocide in Palestine and other places in the world, all these injustices are happening for decades and decades, is because of our institutions. They were partners in the crime. They were not just elites and sitting on the side. All the world leaders that we have, whether in the United States or anywhere else, they are all graduates of Harvard, graduates of Columbia, Ivy Leagues, all these schools. So their graduates, the product of these institutions, is what is causing this disarray and this miserable world affairs that we are witnessing. So in a way, my advice is for the students, actually, you are the one who led this, because you have the better moral compass than people who have went through the institutions and people who are in these institutions. So please do not come to these universities with 100% consent, we want to learn. Come to these institutions to educate. And always, please, do not trust anything you hear in any medical or any other institutions. Always keep a healthy dose of doubt and suspect and add your perspective. Do not trust everything, even whatever we're saying now. Always take it, think about it, and add your perspective to it, because these institutions have not served the world well. And it is time for all of us, after this historical disaster that we're going through, it is time to change our institutions and the whole framework of education and what is permissible and what's not permissible.
Nidal, you sound like an academic now.
What's that?
You sound like an academic
I
now.
like to see myself as a revolutionary. Honestly, I get some sense of allergy whenever I hear academia, but
Don't get him started.
I know. I'm just giving my brother a hard time.
but we need academics. We need the fight again. I mean, this is not something that any one of us can do it alone. We need people from inside, and actually you are the one who struggle more, and I feel with you, and I know it's much harder to fight from inside rather than from outside, but we need both, and we need the students too,
Absolutely.
because I really thought the medical community should have been the one who started the encampment movement. They should have been the leaders to fight against this genocide, because this is literally our job. But because we too have been indoctrinated, have been sanitized through these systems, that's why we did not take the lead. The students took the lead, because the students, they come with innocent heart, innocent brain. They are not indoctrinated yet, and they have always been the moral compass and the leaders of change. So we really owe it to the students. But we promise you that we will do all what we can to support you and to be on your side and to change this together.
Take questions from the audience. If anyone in the audience has questions, there's also questions in the chat that we can ask. If anyone has a burning question. I'll move to the chat and you can think about your questions. So one of the questions is about the focus on women and children and kind of the simultaneous erasure of Palestinian men, and the ways in which kind of this focus can end up legitimizing the frames of anti-Palestinian racism and the frames of kind of like the specter of the terrorist as like a racializing frame that creates bodies that can be killed with impunity. How do you kind of think about like when you're wanting to make an argument in whether it's in Congress or an academic journal, how do you kind of unpack essentially like or how do we kind of reconcile the ways in which these discourses and kind of the demands to focus on women and children also aligns with particular state discourses that create these ungrievable bodies through those sorts of securitizing discourses?
I mean, I can add to this also that we keep saying that about 70% of the victims in Gaza are women and children, which means 30% are men, which means it's justifiable to kill them, which is not, furthest from the truth. Even if we say that, the terrorists are legitimate targets for Israel to do that, even if we accept this fact, it's still 90% of men, more than 90% of men in Gaza and Palestinians are not part of any militant group. So we should be careful about that. The only reason I think we keep using it even in our campaigns is because it's just easier in the medical community and other communities to get more people on board, bringing up the children and the women, and these are almost guaranteed they're not part of any militant groups. But I agree that we should be careful that men also are equal human beings and they deserve protection, and they should not be, their suffering or their loss should not be downgraded. And if you add to that the Palestinians have been under occupation and under apartheid, under genocide for 100 years, even under international law, the Palestinians do have the right to resist by any means necessary. So even with that, it does not give anyone the right to, to kill them. They have a legal they have a legal actually right and duty to fight the occupation, the oppression. So the ones who really should fear any legal consequences or any repercussions are the ones who are imposing this occupation and these inhumane conditions without giving the Palestinians any path for peace, any path for justice, any path for liberation. So what do you expect from them? You've been having them under siege for 20 years and not giving them any path forward. So in a way, you were looking for trouble. So whatever happened, whatever the Palestinians did is a reaction to the structural injustice that they have been living under for 100 years with the silence and the complicity of the whole world. And the world, especially the United States, has no right to say who is a good Palestinian, who's the right bad Palestinians, because the United States has been on board and part of this crime against the Palestinians all along, since at least since 1967. Before that was Britain and France and other countries, but the United States has been the
1948.
major player and the major obstacle to
1948.
justice since then.
Yeah, I think, no, go ahead. David, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I'll just say quickly, Nidal, yeah, that's perfect. And I think this also just exemplifies the limitations of the type of frameworks that we use specifically in health, thinking about international humanitarian law and human rights law, and also thinking about fragmentation of Palestinians, and then also how we talk about them, how we talk about Palestinians as fragmented populations. So for example, in Gaza right now, a lot of the discussion is around humanitarianism and using a humanitarian framework. But again, it's important that we continue to push back against that type of framework because it again, as Nidal and Jess and Brahm and everyone has been saying, we start to drift downstream, and so the identification of the structural determinants of what's going on. So settler colonialism can be quickly discarded if we're continuing to use such frameworks, or if we allow such frameworks to dominate the conversation.
We cannot hear you, Morgan. You're muted.
I was just asking the audience in the room if they had any questions. They're good with the chat. Okay, perfect. So then let's see. I know you all can see the questions as well. So if any panelists see a question they particularly want to speak to, I don't think we're going to have time to speak to all of them. So if there's one you really want to answer, feel free to jump in. I was going to move to one of the questions about actually like fighting repression, like in terms of when we have medical students who are suspended, when we have healthcare workers who are disciplined. We had a press conference in San Diego today for a nurse who was fired for a Palestine sticker on her water bottle. So like, how do we, like, yes, we build collective movements, we build community and we work together, but like, I'm curious if people can kind of speak to both, particularly for healthcare workers and medical students, but also like more broadly, like how do we, we write letters, we show up, we have events like this, but I guess just especially.
No, but there is something more practical, Morgan. I think it's important because we've had medical students, residents, and nurses go through similar things here at UCSF, and we've built a very formidable legal team. I think we just have to be smart. A lot of times, because of whatever fear and anxiety that people have, they may unwittingly accept, being fired or being written up without understanding that there are, still in the system, which is deeply flawed, there's still a system of accountability and laws that we can use to protect, at least try to protect people who have been falsely accused, falsely fired. And at least up here in San Francisco, we have a very, very impressive, formidable legal team that is pushing back against the university and against other institutions, and it's working. Maybe it's not working 100%, maybe it's got some ups and downs, but it is working. And I think, we have to build a kind of legal network of support for all of our solidarity activists so that they can feel like if something like that happens, there is legal recourse. We have to fight. We can't take these kinds of things without pushing back and without fighting back. And that's how power is wielded. And I think we have to really be clear about that. Yeah. Karama. Yeah.
I just wanted to actually, there are a couple of questions here. Is it possible to have someone from the audience come speak or no? Yeah.
I think so, yeah.
So there's a question from Michael Espelin. Has the definition of genocide changed, and is there a new definition within a medical framework? And I think this is a question for Dr. Jbour. And for us at Doctors Against Genocide, because that is one thing that we have been working on, because we think of genocide as a disease that has signs and symptoms that develops over time. So the signs, they start with stigmatization, dehumanization, racialization, segregation, discrimination, apartheid system, settler colonialist, genocidal systems. And there's a buildup until it reaches a critical level where it's okay to kill. So if you think about genocide as a disease, you can start seeing the signs and the symptoms. And at that point, the medical community should intervene before it becomes full blown. So for genocide to be proven legally, there has to be conditions met and proof and evidence and all that. And I learned, Dr. Jbour and myself, we have been spending a lot of time thinking about that. And, Nidal, you can speak to that if you will. But the idea is that the medical community should be alert and quick to diagnose the possibility of genocide immediately and speak up against it to prevent it before it manifests itself. And that is something that needs to be taught in medical school, in nursing schools, in books, courses, continuous medical education. It is really a massive problem, especially with the kind of weapons that humans have right now. Genocide can happen with the blink of an eye. And if we're not able to recognize it and prevent it, we are in for a treat over the next 100 years. You're muted, Nidal.
Let me add the Dr. Against Genocide angle on this too, if you don't mind. So everyone on this panel and anyone else who's interested, please join us, because we are developing a definition for genocide that is called the medical definition of genocide. So the world, we were blessed. Lemkin was there and he came up with the concept of genocide. Then he pushed for the Genocide Convention. That was approved by, the United Nations and the governments. But the genocide, even the Genocide Convention, definition of genocide, was built from the political and legal standpoint, not from the medical standpoint. But we as a medical community, we have a huge difference when it comes to our approach to genocide than what the lawyers and the politicians have. As doctors, we care about protecting life, not about proving, crimes after the fact. If our job is just to prove crimes after the fact and wait for years and years for evidence collections and legals and all these legal deliberations to prove the crime of genocide, yes, we can prove it. It will be good for history, for the books, historical books, but the victims has been already lost, and it's not going to help them. If we as doctors go to school to protect life, our definition should come at the forefront, because it should be a preventative definition, because we care about protecting life. We don't care about what is going to be called after 10 years. That's why the idea, the way we're approaching the definition, medical definition of genocide, first of all, it has to be called early on to try to save the largest amount of lives as possible. We should not wait too long to call it. Once there is all these, precursors of genocide, dehumanization, oppression, dominant group versus vulnerable group, and there is some discrimination, and they start, starting to cause any kind of, atrocities against them. As a medical community, we are obligated to call it a genocide at that point. And we should push into the United Nations this definition that the United Nations should have an independent medical body that is authorized to make this determination. And also, this body should be independent of political intervention, that they should enforce. They should be able to enforce this definition, because our goal is to protect and prevent the loss of life. That's why our definition should be preventive, should be proactive, not reactive. And the other main problem that always fails the victims of genocide is the problem of intent. You have to prove intent. As doctors, I don't care about intent. Whatever your intent is, if you are doing mass murder, mass slaughter of people, there should be no justification for this, no matter what your intent is. I don't even need to prove your intent. From the medical standpoint, if there is a risk, a mass, significant risk to human life, we call it a genocide, a risk of genocide early on, and we push the international community to intervene, whether there is intent or not, whether we can prove the intent or not, because our goal is to protect life, not to have fancy legal, determinations after 10 years. They can still continue their work. We're not against the legal work. We're not against the evidence collection, all these things. But our job is to prevent life at the forefront. So this is something we're trying to add. And what was the question? Sorry, I forgot another question. But I'll stop at this point.
You answered
the
it,
definition of
Nidal.
genocide.
You answered all the questions, so it's fine.
Thank you. There was another question I wanted to answer in the chat, but I can wait on that later on.
Okay.
There is one question from Dr. Malak Rafla, who's a friend in Boston. And his question was about BDS within the hospitals and the universities in North America, Europe, and Australia, and calling for cutting ties with complicit institutions. This is actually part of the campaign, Not Another Child, Not Another Hospital. We want divestment and we want arms embargo. And I think it is one strategy to do this is, as places of healing and care of patients, we should not have any genocidal entities that we support within our spheres. So companies that benefit from the occupation, from the genocide, from the apartheid should not be allowed in our spaces. And this has nothing, it has everything to do with Palestine, but also has nothing to do with Palestine. It's a global thing. We as a medical community, we should not benefit from killing people. And I think that's a very legitimate ask to go to hospitals and institutions and demand it with a lot of courage, because if they push back, what does that say about them? So as part of the big campaign, BDS is a big section of it. And I think we should all look for ways to enforce BDS.
I'll just, I think that's right, Karamap. And there is a very large call from Palestinian civil society, a global call to engage in BDS work. That's what Palestinian civil society is telling the world. If you want to be in solidarity with Palestine, you need to be engaged with some aspect of BDS in your local community. And we in the medical profession, just like Karama said, we have to engage in that too, because if we're really going to have healing spaces, how can we tolerate having organizations or institutions that are promoting genocide and harm to so many people? So I want to encourage everybody who's listening or who's attending this to check in with your local communities around the BDS work that's being done. There's a lot of BDS work going on at universities, at various medical centers. We're doing quite a bit here in the Bay Area. So it should be part of our work, absolutely.
I'll just because I think it's a little bit related to I can read Mark's question here and sort of give a brief answer because I think it touches on something that we're already seeing doctors doing too, even beyond Palestine, right? So can healthcare workers add clinical support to liberation and disruption to overcome the siloed thinking among the economic elite class? So, you know, one of the ways I think we're seeing this, right, not related to Palestine, is unionizing, right? We're seeing residents residents do this, faculty do this, because they're recognizing too from this perspective of healing, right, that, you know, allowing business interests to dominate, right, and determine everything that's happening with their patients, right, more and more, and taking away more power from doctors is bad for patients for the reason they came into medicine, right? And so finding ways to disrupt the, you know, business approach to healthcare, right, is one way to do that. So I think what I would hope is, right, that that you know, doctors and other healthcare workers can build on those experiences to also get the courage to, you know, because anyone who's been close to that kind of experience knows how hard the hospitals, you know, and try to stop it from happening, right? You know, to take courage, you know, that requires a lot of courage and a lot of fortitude, and similarly to build towards disruptive efforts, right, on behalf of Palestine, like the ones that Karama and Nidal and Jess were just talking about too, right, with regard to BDS and how that can start to be pulled into our hospitals and our spaces of healing. So I think we're seeing some positive signs there, and that we can really build on. And, you know, we have a lot of power, right? You know, healthcare workers, right? We, you know, there's, you know, if we were unified and can make some demands, right, you know, there's a lot we could achieve, right? It requires that real, you know, work of organizing, but you know, it's something to really think about.
So I want to thank our panelists so much for joining us for this great.
Can I answer one more question, please, before we go?
Yeah, for sure.
So there is this question from Shanika about the Jewish people have claims to this land, and does Israel has the right to exist? So every people have, you know, the right to self-determination, the Jewish people, the Palestinian people, the Christian people, but there is a caveat. No one has the right to exist or the right to self-determination at the expense of another people. Your freedom ends when you encroach on the freedom and the liberty of someone else. If the Jewish people came in Palestine and the Palestinians welcomed them in the beginning and they accepted to live in Palestine as equals to all other Palestinians and be among us, Palestine was the only country that opened its arms for the Jewish people due to the persecution that went through Europe when the United States closed its doors to the Jewish people. Europe closed its doors. So the Jewish people were welcome to Palestine. The problem did not start by the Jewish people coming to Palestine, but when they start thinking that they want to have or establish an exclusive country to the Jewish people at our land, at our expense, this is where the problem lies. So Israel does not have the right to exist in its current structure and with its current supremacist ethnocracy. If there is enough space in Palestine for everyone to live equally and in peace, the Christian people do not have the right to exist in the United States by themselves as an exclusive, group of people. If we do not accept this in the United States, why should we accept it in Palestine, in Israel, or anywhere else? So people have the right to self-determination. Everyone has the right to self-determination. We agree with that. But again, as long as it does not come at the expense of anyone else, if you want to have your own very exclusive and pure country, you can go to Mars. You can go anywhere else where there is no human beings, and you can do whatever you want. But on our land, we are the natives there, and no one has the right to exclusive state on our land. They are welcome to be with us as our guests, as our members of our country, nation, for everyone, but no one has the right to exclusive existence. Thank you. And regarding the sacrifices of the students or doctors here in the United States, this is the last one. Yes, none of us is enjoying this. There is always a risk. We are all taking some risk. Some of us are taking more risk than others. But none of these risks, counts when you think about how much risk are the children in Gaza are going through, the mothers in Gaza, the grandmothers, the people with heart disease, the people with cancer, the people with dementia. So if you don't want to take any risk at all, I mean, honestly, life by itself is a risk taking. Just walking the street, driving the street, there is always a risk. So everyone is welcome to measure whatever the risk they want to have. But if you want to have, a moral compass and respect for yourself before anyone else, we should do this not just for the sake of Palestine and Gaza. We should do this for the sake of the United States. I think if we are true patriot Americans, we should not allow America to be on the wrong side of history. We should not allow America to be complicit and fund a genocide. This is bad for America before anyone else. So we should not allow it to happen also as healthcare workers, as people who protect life. We respect the sanctity of life. I mean, if you check this at every level, this is wrong. We should be against it. Whether you are, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, American, Chinese, Mexican, whatever you are, we should have a universal stand against this. I promise, no more intervention.
No, that was a great note to end on. Thank you so much. And I want to thank all of the panelists so much for their time and so much for coming. And I also want to thank the audience both in person and on Zoom who took time out of their night to be here. We have some zines in the back if you're here in person, so please help yourselves. And thank you all again.
Thank you so much, Morgan.
Thank
for
you, everyone.
putting this together.
Thank you, Morgan.
You did an amazing job. And thank you,
to the
David, for being
students.
there
Thank you to
to
the
support
students.
her.
Thanks, Morgan. Thanks,
Thank you.
David.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Thank you.